Yeah, I got sober a long time ago out in Los Angeles, I know, 35, 36 years ago. And I was crazy, I was insane, I was sick unto death, drunk and insane, and
Few actors in history have mastered transformation quite like Sir Anthony Hopkins. For over 6 decades, he has moved between monsters and men, saints and sinners. Each role performed with such quiet precision that audiences forget they're watching an actor at all. Now, at 88 years old, Hopkins remains a living study in discipline, humility, and the eternal curiosity that keeps great artists alive. When asked about his favorite films, he doesn't speak like a critic or a collector. He talks about scripts, about the rhythm of words, about the way dialogue can inform your body the way music guides a pianist's hands. For Hopkins, cinema is not just performance. It's a conversation between actor and story, a duet between instinct and structure. The 6 films he names as his favorites reveal not only what he admires as an artist, but what he values as a man: empathy, precision, and truth. Some are his own masterpieces, others are classics that once ignited his imagination. Together, they trace the evolution of a performer who still believes that every day is a rehearsal. Number 6. Nixon, 1995.
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair.
When Anthony Hopkins took on the role of Richard Nixon, even his closest friends wondered why. After all, Nixon wasn't a character audiences loved. He was the scarred face of scandal, paranoia, and political downfall. But that's exactly what drew Hopkins in. He once said in an interview with the Oklahoman that he felt great empathy for Nixon, a man of immense pride who loved being president and then screwed it up. He described him as a lonely, tragic figure and added that he was surprised Nixon didn't simply blow his brains out after Watergate, Oklahoman.com. To Hopkins, Nixon wasn't a villain. He was Shakespearean. He's like King Lear, he said, a man collapsing under the weight of his own ambition. Hopkins saw in him the perfect study of contradiction, the hunger for greatness shadowed by insecurity and guilt. That empathy became the foundation of his performance. Under Oliver Stone's intense direction, Hopkins didn't try to impersonate Nixon. He tried to understand him. The voice, the hunched posture, the haunted eyes, all built from compassion, not caricature. Hopkins later recalled how he approached the role as a kind of excavation. "You don't play the mask," he said. "You play what's behind it." He studied tapes of Nixon's late-night speeches, the stumbles and sighs between sentences, the way his hands clenched when he lied to himself. He found humanity in the pauses, the tremors that revealed more than the words ever could. When Nixon premiered in 1995, many critics were stunned. Roger Ebert wrote that Hopkins had somehow captured Nixon's melancholy grandeur. It was less imitation than embodiment, a man drowning in his own contradictions. The film earned Hopkins another Academy Award nomination, but awards were secondary. For him, the real reward was discovering that empathy could transform even the most despised figure into something recognizably human. Hopkins once explained that acting, at its best, is an act of forgiveness. "You look for the part of them that's you," he said. "You find the wound." That's what he did with Nixon. Turned a political headline into a psychological portrait. He refused to judge, choosing instead to explore the loneliness that power conceals. It's a theme that runs through much of his work. Men imprisoned by duty, unable to show their hearts until it's too late. There's a quiet moment in Nixon that Hopkins has said he's particularly proud of. When the president sits alone in the Lincoln bedroom, speaking softly to a portrait of John F. Kennedy. "I'm not a crook," he mutters, but the words sound like a plea for mercy rather than a defense. That was the tone Hopkins brought to the entire film. Not outrage, not satire, but sorrow. It's what made the performance unforgettable. Decades later, Hopkins still points to Nixon as one of the most demanding roles of his career. not because of the politics, but because of the humanity. He proved that empathy isn't weakness, it's clarity. To see people fully, even at their worst, is the actor's greatest challenge, and perhaps his greatest gift. Do you think it's important for actors to empathize with the characters they play, even when those characters have done unforgivable things? Number 5, On the Waterfront, 1954.
I better get you home. There's too many guys around here with only one thing in their mind. Am I gonna see you again?
What for?
Long before Anthony Hopkins ever stood in front of a camera, he was sitting in a dark theater in Wales, watching Marlon Brando redefine what acting could be. The film was On the Waterfront, and it didn't just impress him, it converted him. Hopkins would later say that Brando's famous taxicab scene was still breathtaking, decades after its release. It was the moment he realized that acting could be alive, spontaneous, truthful, unpolished. "I could have been a contender," Brando says, his voice trembling between anger and regret. Hopkins said that line echoed in his mind for years. It wasn't the words themselves, it was what Brando did between them. The hesitation, the confusion, the quiet heartbreak. Hopkins once admitted that Brando's performance in that scene was the reason he became an actor. "He changed the language of film," he said. "He made it human again." At that time, British acting was rooted in theatrical precision, diction, posture, restraint. But here was Brando, mumbling, sweating, feeling. For a young Hopkins, who often felt out of step with polite British training, this was liberation. Watching On the Waterfront was like discovering permission to be raw. It showed him that truth mattered more than polish, that silence could speak louder than a soliloquy. In later interviews, Hopkins often returned to that idea, the truth of behavior. He admired Brando's willingness to let a pause, a glance, or a shrug carry emotional weight. Hopkins said, "Brando didn't act, he existed." You could see his thoughts moving behind his eyes. That observation would become central to Hopkins' own approach, especially in his quieter roles, like The Remains of the Day or The Father. He learned from Brando that the audience doesn't need to be told what a character feels. They need to see it, honestly, without decoration. On the Waterfront also resonated with Hopkins for its theme of moral awakening. Terry Malloy's struggle to speak the truth mirrors something Hopkins often talks about, the idea of integrity as rebellion. Hopkins once said that real courage, both in life and art, is simply to tell the truth and take the consequences. That philosophy can be traced back to this movie. Terry risks everything to stand up to corruption. He loses his friends, his safety, his future, but gains his soul. Hopkins has called On the Waterfront one of the greatest acting lessons ever filmed. Not just because of Brando, but because every supporting performance, from Carl Malden to Ava Marie Saint, feels authentic. He admired how director Elia Kazan built tension from small gestures and close-ups, creating intimacy instead of spectacle. Hopkins once joked that he could watch Brando butter bread for 2 hours, because even that would feel alive. In a way, On the Waterfront set the emotional template for Hopkins' entire career. The stillness, the restraint, the unspoken emotion, all trace back to that cab scene. It taught him that acting isn't about pretending. It's about remembering what it feels like to be human. Do you think Hopkins ever matched Brando's raw power? And if so, in which of his performances did you see it most? Number 4, The Bounty, 1984.
Get your knees up, Quintal. I'm doing my best, sir. Don't answer back.
Some bloody sailors! Some bloody dancers!
Every actor has a film that slips quietly through the cracks. A project that meant more to them than the audience ever realized. For Anthony Hopkins, that film is The Bounty. He has called it one of his personal favorites, not because it won awards or box office glory, but because it tested his discipline and deepened his respect for storytelling itself. In 1984, Hopkins stepped aboard a recreation of the HMS Bounty to play Lieutenant William Bligh, the stern, exacting captain whose authority collapses when his crew, led by Mel Gibson's Fletcher Christian, stages a legendary mutiny. Hopkins later told Far Out magazine that the film nearly took a very different form. Under the late director David Lean, the original script would have stretched to 4 or 5 hours. When Roger Donaldson took over, the screenplay was tightened and Hopkins said he was relieved. The story had been condensed into a manageable length. It became, he said, the version he was proud to sail with. Hopkins' portrayal of Bligh isn't the caricature audiences expected. Previous versions painted the captain as a sadist. Hopkins found the man inside the myth, rigid, intelligent, frightened of losing control. He approached Bligh not as a villain, but as a professional undone by pride. The key to command, Hopkins once remarked, is fear, and the fear of being disobeyed. That tension pulses through every scene. His clipped orders, his desperate eyes scanning an endless sea of rebellion. What Hopkins valued most about The Bounty was its moral ambiguity. No one is entirely right, no one entirely wrong. It's the human condition distilled to wind, salt, and ego. He admired that Donaldson's version refused melodrama. It let the ocean itself judge its characters. You can feel that realism in every shot. The storms were real, the deck slick with cold water, the ropes biting into hands. Hopkins did much of the grueling work himself, believing that authenticity couldn't be faked. He later said that enduring those conditions reminded him of theater. You can't pretend to be cold, you either are or you're not. The role also tapped into one of Hopkins' lifelong fascinations, leadership. He's often spoken about how authority exposes the soul, how power isolates those who wield it. In The Bounty, Bligh's obsession with order becomes his undoing. The same flaw that fascinates Hopkins in so many of his characters, from Nixon to Hannibal Lecter. Watching Bligh lose his ship but cling to his dignity, Hopkins found a kind of tragic purity. When Bligh navigates 3,600 miles in an open boat after the mutiny, surviving impossible odds, Hopkins saw not cruelty, but endurance. He was a survivor, he said, and survival is never pretty. Critics have since called The Bounty one of the most nuanced takes on the legend, a film about duty rather than heroism. Hopkins' performance anchors it, cold yet oddly sympathetic. A man who mistakes control for safety. It's easy to see why the actor cherishes it. For a craftsman who reveres perfect scripts, The Bounty was a reminder that imperfection, the unpredictable sea, the human error, can make art feel alive. Would you side with Bligh's discipline or Christian's rebellion? When rules collide with conscience, which would you follow? Number 3, The Father, 2020. When The Father was released in 2020, many critics called it a late career miracle.
I live in Paris.
No, Dad, why do you keep going on about Paris?
You told me.
No, I didn't.
I'm sorry, Anne, you told me the other day. Have you forgotten? She's forgotten. Paris. They don't even speak English there.
But for Anthony Hopkins, it wasn't a miracle. It was a culmination. Decades of craft, intuition, and observation converged into a single devastating performance. At 83, he gave the world a portrayal of dementia so raw that even seasoned audiences found themselves lost in his confusion. He would later call the film's screenplay 99.99% perfect, telling The New Yorker that when writing is that good, the actor doesn't act. He simply listens. The words inform your body, he said, comparing it to playing Chopin. Follow the notes, and the emotion appears on its own. Hopkins approached The Father with the discipline of a musician. Every pause, every stammer, every flicker of realization followed the rhythm of Florian Zeller's dialogue. He didn't study medical symptoms or psychological theory. He studied truth, the quiet terror of not knowing what's real. In interviews, he said he wanted the audience to feel what it's like to lose the map. That empathy drove him deeper than technique ever could. He didn't perform dementia, he invited us inside it. The result was both intimate and universal. Hopkins' Anthony, a proud man resisting the erosion of his mind, is not a saint or a victim. He's angry, witty, frightened, manipulative, and deeply human. One moment he's charming his daughter, the next he's accusing her of betrayal. The walls of his flat shift imperceptibly. The faces around him change. Time folds in on itself. Hopkins plays each disorientation with haunting authenticity. "It's all right, Anne," he says near the end, breaking down like a child. "I feel as if I'm losing all my leaves." No music, no tricks, just a man stripped bare before the inevitable. For Hopkins, the film wasn't about aging, it was about surrender. He often says that acting, at its core, is letting go, not controlling. In The Father, he found the perfect vehicle for that philosophy. The character's loss of control became the actor's path to truth. Director Florian Zeller later said that Hopkins would sometimes finish a take and simply sit in silence, eyes wet, as if still half inside the memory he just relived. Crew members called those moments the quiet storms. The performance earned Hopkins his second Academy Award, nearly 3 decades after The Silence of the Lambs. When his name was announced, he was asleep at home in Wales. The next morning, he recorded a short video humbly dedicating the award to Chadwick Boseman. That simple gesture summed up the man behind the genius. Grateful, private, still in awe of the craft itself. Looking back, Hopkins has said that The Father was a gift of a lifetime, not because it brought him recognition, but because it reminded him what art can do, make us feel seen. "It's not about memory loss," he said, "it's about love." In those final trembling words of the film, when Anthony begs for his mother, the boundary between actor and character disappears. We're no longer watching Sir Anthony Hopkins. We're witnessing humanity itself, unguarded. How did The Father make you feel about memory and identity? Do you think losing one's past erases who we are, or just reveals what truly remains? Number 2, The Remains of the Day, 1993.
Until he has done all he can to be of service to his employer.
If The Father was a film about losing control, then The Remains of the Day is about never allowing yourself to have it in the first place. For Anthony Hopkins, James Ivory's quiet 1993 masterpiece represents one of the most delicate performances of his career, and one of the few films he calls 99.99% perfect. He said in The New Yorker that a screenplay like this is like Chopin. You just play the notes and the emotion appears. It's not a film about what's said, but what's suppressed. Hopkins plays Stevens, a dutiful English butler whose life has been spent in service to others. His posture is immaculate, his tone unwavering, his face almost unreadable. Yet behind that mask of professionalism is a man who has traded his heart for a code of manners. The story follows him through years of quiet repression as he fails to confess his love to Miss Kenton, played by Emma Thompson, and later reflects on what might have been. Hopkins' performance is so restrained that a single breath, a flicker of hesitation, feels like an emotional earthquake. He once said that The Remains of the Day was one of the hardest roles he ever played, precisely because it required him to do nothing. Stillness, he explained, is the hardest thing for an actor. You have to let the silence carry you, and it's in those silences, especially in the devastating scene where Stevens and Miss Kenton touch hands only to pull apart, that the entire tragedy of the film lives. Hopkins described moments like that as music in slow motion. Each pause, each glance, each unspoken confession is a note of heartbreak. In interviews, Hopkins has compared working with James Ivory to performing chamber music. Everything is precise, measured, and collaborative. There was no improvisation, he said, because none was needed. The script, adapted from Kazuo Ishiguro's novel, gave him all the clues. The words tell you everything. You just have to trust them. That trust became the foundation of his performance, a masterclass in emotional minimalism. What makes The Remains of the Day so profound, Hopkins says, is its exploration of regret, not as a single mistake, but as a lifetime of small denials. He thought duty was love, Hopkins once reflected about Stevens, He thought control was strength. But in the end, he realizes he's missed the one thing that mattered. It's a realization Hopkins delivers with heartbreaking restraint, never crying, never begging, just standing in the rain, smiling politely as his soul breaks. Critics hailed it as one of the finest performances ever captured on film. Pauline Kael wrote that Hopkins could make you weep without changing his expression, and indeed he does. You don't see the emotion, you feel it, vibrating beneath the surface. That's the Hopkins trademark, acting so subtle it feels invisible. Even today, he still speaks about the remains of the day with reverence. It's about the silence in life, he said, what we don't say, what we lose because we're afraid to speak. Have you ever let something slip away because you stayed silent? Do you think dignity is worth more than emotional honesty? Number 1. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991.
Good morning.
Dr. Lecter, my name is Clarice Starling. May I speak with you?
You're one of Jack Crawford's, aren't you?
When The Silence of the Lambs arrived in 1991, it didn't just redefine the thriller, it redefined Anthony Hopkins. In less than 25 minutes of screen time, he created one of the most iconic characters in film history. Dr. Hannibal Lecter, the brilliant, elegant, and terrifying cannibal whose calm intelligence was more chilling than any act of violence. Hopkins once said in The New Yorker that when he first read the script, he didn't even finish it before calling his agent. "This is a wonderful part," he remembered saying. "I want to play him." The script, Hopkins later said, was 99.99% perfect. It didn't need embellishment, improvisation, or grand theatrics. It only needed trust. The words, he said, inform your body. That's how he found Lecter's stillness, not through menace, but through rhythm. He read the lines slowly, precisely, as though savoring them like a fine meal. The pauses became his punctuation marks. The result was hypnotic. A man whose politeness was more dangerous than his appetite. Hopkins approached Lecter as a study in psychology rather than horror. He once joked that he recognized something familiar in the character. "I have an instinct for narcissists." Instead of playing evil, he played intelligence, a predator who sees through everyone else's masks. His decision to rarely blink, to hold Clarice Starling's gaze just a little too long, turned the simple act of looking into an act of domination. Director Jonathan Demme said the performance worked because Hopkins never overplayed it. He lets the audience imagine what he's capable of. That subtlety became legend. The scene in which Lecter first meets Clarice, standing perfectly still in his glass cell, voice soft, diction flawless, is now etched into pop culture. Hopkins said he studied the way reptiles move, how they conserve energy until the precise moment of attack. Stillness, he explained, is power. And nowhere in cinema is that more evident than in Lecter's soft-spoken cruelty. A line like, "I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti," delivered not as a threat, but as a confession of pleasure. Behind the horror, though, Hopkins saw humanity, the mirror image of Clarice's courage. He admires her, Hopkins said. He doesn't want to kill her. He wants to understand her. That complexity is what makes Lecter unforgettable. He's not a monster. He's a man whose intellect devoured his empathy. Hopkins' performance won him the Academy Award for Best Actor, and the film swept the Oscars, becoming one of only 3 movies in history to win all 5 major categories. More than 3 decades later, Hopkins still reflects on The Silence of the Lambs with gratitude. "It was a great script," he said simply. "I just followed the notes." In that modest statement lies his philosophy of acting. Let the work speak. Don't show the fear, let the silence carry it. What's the line or moment from Hannibal Lecter that still sends chills down your spine? And why do you think we can't look away from him? At 88 years old, Sir Anthony Hopkins stands as a reminder that mastery is not about mystery. It's about consistency, humility, and curiosity. His 6 favorite films reveal the anatomy of that mastery. From Nixon's tortured loneliness to The Silence of the Lamb's cold control, from The Bounty's command and chaos to The Father's emotional surrender, Each film reflects a part of his own artistic journey. He values stories that test empathy, scripts that demand precision, and directors who trust silence more than spectacle. Hopkins often says that great acting is learning to listen. Listening to the script, to your fellow actors, to the rhythm beneath the words. In every one of these films, whether he's serving tea in the remains of the day or serving terror in the silence of the lambs, he listens. He lets the story move through him, not the other way around. That's what makes him timeless. He spent a lifetime studying humanity from every angle. Its pride, its fear, its hunger for connection. Even now, he still calls himself a student. Every day, he says, is a rehearsal. It's a statement that sums up his entire philosophy. Art doesn't end when the applause fades. It lives on in curiosity. So the next time you watch one of his films, look beyond the performance. Watch the patience, the precision, the pauses. Because within those silences lies the truth of Anthony Hopkins. Not a legend pretending to be human, but a human who never stopped searching for truth in the act of pretending. Which of these 6 films speaks to you the most? And which one will you rewatch tonight? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this cinematic journey through the mind of a master, don't forget to like and subscribe.